Alright, we're talking about Season 1 of Record of Ragnarok, and I'm sure there's a lot of mixed opinions going around in the community, and with good reason, so to keep this spoiler free, I won't be getting into heavy detail on what exactly I have my issues with or what I especially liked, as in I won't be mentioning specific character names or certain events because, to be honest, I don't think it'll be necessary to get into spoilers anyway, so if you haven't watched it yet and have no idea what this anime is about and hear me mention anything about rounds or fights, it's literally nothing more than what you can read on the plot summary, so this whole review is essentially spoiler free. And to keep things simple, I'm going to be breaking this down by categories, so talking about the story, art, sound, and ultimately my final position on it. So with that out of the way, let's get started. So the story for Ragnarok is actually where I find the most problems, especially if you're not a manga reader, because what you're expecting is what you read on the label, a 1v1 fantasy showdown, and if you're gonna sell this, an idea that's been done a million other times, then you just have to come different. And on a surface level, Ragnarok is different. It has its own formula that feels exclusive. It's the reason why there's like 3 to 4 other manga out right now copying what it's doing, because it works, and most importantly because it sells. But just formula on its own isn't enough. There's a reason why if I pay you, who doesn't know how to make a cake, and a baker the same amount of money to make me a cake, and you're both using the same formula, 9 out of 10 times the baker's just going to end up making the better cake. That's just how this works. And I offer you that because Ragnarok as a manga is selling millions on its own with a story formula that feels exclusive to it. There's a reason why people describe Ragnarok as a mesh between Fate Stay Night and Kengan, or even recommend something like One Punch Man, because simply put, there just isn't anything else that's similar to it right now. There just isn't. And I say this because the story is entirely dependent on this formula, but not just the formula, but also its style. Put it this way, if I have no idea what the story is about, right, but you're telling me right now it's a 1v1 fight to the death tournament in an arena where there's a crowd of thousands, an announcer, oh, and by the way, the characters are the most powerful humans and gods throughout history, then I'm expecting a lot. So what's my point? My point is the sheer expectation that not just manga readers were putting on this, but also casual fans who had no idea what they were getting into was actually warranted. The hype and expectations were deserving here. We can't kid ourselves. And if you're gonna say, well, it's not the anime's fault if you get disappointed, well, then you have a point. But then again, this anime is based on a manga that's selling millions in its home country, breaking into the top 10 sales even. So just think about that for a moment. There's even objective reason to fall back on because there's a number. It's millions in sales and volumes, meaning Ragnarok is a big name whether you believe it or not. I just say all of this now because regardless of how disappointed or how satisfied you were with the anime, if you've already seen it, which I imagine you have, I will not blame you whatsoever if you feel just disappointed or even loved it, whatever the case may be, because the hype was deserved. Your expectations for this were not irrational if they were high. And I know I haven't even talked about the story yet, but that's because I just want to offer you that style and formula mattered for this as an anime. And when it comes to formula, what matters most is your narrative, and when it comes to style, what matters most is your presentation. And don't get it confused, there's a difference between narrative and presentation, but that doesn't mean one doesn't affect the other either. Do you see where I'm going with this? Because when it comes to the narrative in Ragnarok, the whole thing was just info dumped on us in the first round, almost like there was no room to breathe and actually enjoy what should have been the center of attention, that which was the fight itself, round 1. And to be fair, in the manga, where I find round 1 to be just an absolute spectacle, right, just seeing two absolute studs brawling it out. And let me just say this now, I'll be the first one to tell you, round 1 in the manga felt like I was actually in the arena, almost like it's Madison Square Garden, seeing what could have been Conor McGregor versus Floyd Mayweather. That's just how good the narrative and overall style appeal to me. It's just that good. And that's because the style of the setting, the way I imagined the announcer introducing the fighters, right, the way the narrative structured its world building, it all felt inspiring and made me want to read the next chapter. And now that I'm experiencing it in animation, none of it felt like it was actually there for round 1. The first backstory we got was just so empty with no reason to care and looked just overall unimpressive. I felt just forced to continue watching. And I'll be honest, there was some good moments in the first fight. I think the art was done really well, but that's as far as I can go. The amount of story that just felt forced was way too much, and I understand that from a manga reader's point of view, we do get a lot of information in the first few chapters. I realize that, but that's where your style is there to help relieve that, or else your narrative has no choice but to take over and you lose the center of attention, which is the fight. It has to be the fight. Put it this way, the point of any and all physical combat in anime is show don't tell. I think we can all agree on that, right? And even though, again, the first few chapters are loaded with exposition, and I mean loaded, I never once felt like that part of the storytelling was a burden in the manga. And when it comes to style, that's just your bread and butter. You don't need to tell me how the sword is cutting, or how the axe comes down, or the force of how hard any punch is, because if I can see it visually, it just shouldn't matter. It shouldn't. And this is where the story suffers the most, because it isn't just the lack of show don't tell. I think even the soundtrack was at fault here. Now say what you will, if you enjoyed the music, then all the power to you, right? I'm not gonna rain on anyone's parade here, nor is that my intention, but can can you just imagine if we had Hiroyuki Sawano on this? Just by example, because let's forget about the animation for a moment, or lack thereof, because when it comes to style, there's really only two things you're looking for: what you're hearing and what you're seeing, right? Because you're not touching the story, you're not tasting it, all that matters is what you're hearing and what you're seeing. And if one is so good to the point you're ignoring the other, then it doesn't matter how bad it looks. If you're going back a couple minutes to hear the way your favorite character's line was said, or to hear that one moment the music started because it was just, you know, at the right moment. Do you see where I'm going with this? And for me, I'll be brutal, the soundtrack was just simply average. And for a show, again, where its style and formula are so unique and well recognized that it's selling millions, you expect a level of quality that should be met. And if it doesn't meet that standard, then guess what? You're not wrong for that. So average doesn't cut it for me. And to be fair, that's probably the most I can say for the show as an overall product. It's just average. And I know I mentioned the name Hiroyuki Sawano a bit earlier, and if you don't know who that is, then I highly recommend just looking him up, because as a composer, he's just legendary. But that's because he isn't average, right? He isn't just doing his job, he's doing it leagues above everyone else in his own field. And for a story like Ragnarok, average animation and sound just isn't enough. There's a difference between getting the job done, getting it done right, and going beyond. And for me, the soundtrack is just getting it done and nothing more. And I know it sounds like I'm ripping the soundtrack apart here, but I have to say the voice acting was great. Now, I've only heard the Japanese dub, but from what I could gather, it's full of talent, especially Shiva, who I think really nailed his character, whoever his voice actor is, because he was just impressive even in those moments where there's barely any dialogue for him. And for what I can say about even the best moments, and I mean the moments where I actually felt impressed, which to be honest were few, but still, I think it would just be me lying if I told you here this was more but an average anime. Now, if I'm gonna talk about the art and animation, there's really only one way I can do it without spoilers, so you're gonna have to follow me here. I think if I can divide the anime into 3 parts, I would call it like this: tolerable, decent, and then unacceptable. And I'm saying it like this because there are moments that can be enjoyed, don't misunderstand me, but I do think that there's so few and far in between that if I were to get into spoilers, this would just be a video of me ranting about everything I disliked, because it just outweighs what I did like. Do you see what I'm saying? And really, I'm sorry if this does sound like a rant or like I'm trashing something you honestly feel completely opposite about, but for what it's worth, I do admit there is some merit to the art and animation. Now, if you get what I'm trying to imply by dividing this anime into 3 parts, then I'll tell you now, I was ready to give up by the end of the first fight. Honest, I thought I'd saw enough to make a judgment call then and there and not waste my time any further. And then I kept going, and before I knew it, I ended up rewatching this 3 times. Now I'm working on my 4th rewatch. Now, I'm a sucker boy, I'm a fan. You give me anything about Record of Ragnarok and I'm the first one there talking about it, regardless of how bad it is. Again, I'm a fan, that's just me. But I did feel inclined to just stop watching, I'm not gonna lie about that. And even after watching it 3 times, at some point it did just become unacceptable. And now you're probably saying, well, if you've seen it 3 times already, then there's something you must like, right? And again, I'm a fanboy, I love the story no matter which way you tell it. My whole YouTube channel is about this manga, you get my point, right? But after a while, I had to be realistic, because even calling it decent midway through the show, I felt still wasn't enough for what I expected. Like, yeah, okay, the opening sounded fine and I really liked the ending track and all, but the lack of actual animation makes me question if you can even qualify this as an anime at all. Of course, I don't mean that literally, but it begs the question, why? Why did it turn out like this when you have slice of life anime that get almost movie level quality in this day and age? And I don't have the answer, I really don't. Alright guys, so I'm gonna leave it there. I think I've said all about I've had to say. Let me know how you feel about the anime in the comments. If you agreed or if you disagreed, please feel free to let me know and let's get a conversation going. And if you don't know, then my whole channel is pretty much based on Record of Ragnarok, where I mainly talk about the manga, so if you're interested in that, please subscribe if you're down, I'd greatly appreciate it. Leave a like if you enjoyed this review, and thank you so much for watching guys. Have a great day.